Welcome, everyone, to our first program of 2019. So pleased that so many could make it here today, and so pleased that we're still able to continue our work here at the Wilson Center during this difficult time. Some brief note about some upcoming events. On Wednesday, January 23rd at 5:30, we'll have the next in our installment on the Central Asian Cinema Series. It will be the East Coast film premiere of Centaur. On Monday, January 28th, we will have a talk by Ivan Kurila, a prominent Russian historian, who will be talking about history and memory in post-Soviet Russia. On Tuesday, January 29th, at 3 p.m., we will have a film screening and discussion of Stalin and the Black Book of Soviet Jewry. And in a final effort at shameless self-promotion, on Thursday, February 7th, we will have the book launch of my book on law in the Russian state, so that will be forthcoming. Well, we're very pleased to have everyone here for another in our series of the Daniel Morgan Graduate School-Kennan Institute Distinguished Speaker Series. This has become a very important event for us. It allows us to collaborate with our colleagues at the Daniel Morgan Graduate School and to promote the goal of the Kennan Institute of promoting American understanding of Russia and the region. And our affiliation with DMGS, with the Daniel Morgan School, enables us to further that mission. Today, we're going to be talking about kleptocracy, domestic and international impacts of kleptocracy, and we have three leading experts on the subject. I'll give brief bios at the beginning, and then we'll have each of them talk for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to discussion as soon as possible. But our first speaker will be Dr. Edward Lemon, who is the Daniel Morgan Graduate School Kennan Institute Fellow at the Daniel Morgan Graduate School. He previously was a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the Harriman Institute at Columbia. He did his PhD he received his PhD in 2016 from the University of Exeter. He has worked extensively in Central Asia, in Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, as well as other countries. His research has been widely published, including the Central Asian Survey, Central Asian Affairs, Foreign Affairs, and the Review of Middle Eastern Studies. Our second speaker will be Casey Michel, who is a reporter with Think Progress, where he covers kleptocracy and money laundering issues, amongst other topics. He is a member of the Advisory Council at the Hudson Institute's Kleptocracy Initiative, and he received his master's degree from Columbia University's Harriman Institute. He also is widely published in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Politico magazine, and The Atlantic. And our third speaker will be Jodi Vittori, who is a fellow with Carnegie's Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program. She researches the linkages of corruption, conflict, and conflict finance, illicit financial flows, and national security. Previously, she served as a senior policy analyst advisor for Global Witness. She also previously served in the United States Air Force, advancing to the rank of lieutenant colonel, and was stationed in numerous spots overseas, including Afghanistan, Iraq, South Korea, and Saudi Arabia. Finally, she is the author of the book Terrorist Financing and Resourcing, and is the co-author of the handbook Corruption, Threats, and International Missions, Practical Guidance for Leaders. So just an excellent panel. We look forward to hearing it from everybody. And Ed?
Perfect. Well, thank you. Thank you, Will, and thank you for the Kennan Institute for hosting us today. I'm going to talk a little bit about Tajikistan. My comments will be focused on Tajikistan, but they could equally apply to many other countries of the world. It's just a matter that I have particular expertise. Tajikistan is a kleptocratic nepotocracy, i.e. it's rule by a family of thieves. Nepotocracy refers to the dominance of the Rahmon family over politics and business within the country. The Tajik president, Emomali Rahmon, has ruled since 1992. He has the fortune of having 9 children and an extended family who've come to dominate politics and business within the country. His son was the youngest mayor of a capital city in the world when he was appointed mayor of Dushanbe 2 years ago at the tender age of 29. His daughter is his chief of staff, and many other people have used marriage as a means to gain access to the family and the wealth, and opportunities to plunder the state that marrying into the family offers. One of his son-in-laws is the deputy head of the National Bank. Another son-in-law, Shamsullah Sahibov, controls large sectors of the gold industry and various other industries within the country. And his brother-in-law controls the largest airline in the country and the largest private bank. Tajikistan, according to the IMF in 2011, experienced 60% of its GDP in capital flight, i.e. money that was taken out of the economy and deposited in offshore tax havens in places like the British Virgin Islands, Guernsey, and other tax havens around the world, including some states within the United States, I think, as Casey will talk about in his comments. Just two examples to sort of illustrate how kleptocracy works in this small state of 8 million people, the poorest post-Soviet state, where GDP per capita is around $800. Talco, which is the largest industrial enterprise, it's a large Soviet-built aluminium smelter, generates something like at least about 10 years ago, generated a third of the country's GDP and up to half of its export revenues, employs something like 10,000 people, paying employees sometimes salaries of under $100 a month. Talco became, and a case involving Talco management and the government, the previous management and the government, became the most expensive court case in British legal history when it was finally settled after 4 years in 2008. It came under British jurisdiction because the previous managers had registered the offshore entity that they were controlling, the aluminium smelter, in Guernsey. And so that brought it under British jurisdiction. And so after 4 years, the government alone had spent 120 million on this court case, which at the time was 5.2% of the country's GDP, or the GDP per capita equivalent of 170,000 people in the country of 8 million people. Another example, China loaned the country 280 million to build a road, rebuild the road between the two largest cities in the country. Loaned 280 million for that. Quickly, when the road was open, which was actually when I first moved to Tajikistan in 2010, toll booths began to spring up. And everyone was a little confused. Where do these toll roads come from? And then it turns out they were controlled by a company called Innovative Road Solutions that claimed global expertise in the sort of road building, road maintenance industry. No one could really find out anything about this entity until a journalist at Deutsche Welle started doing some digging. And he found that the company had no previous record, had registered in the country a few months before winning an uncompetitive tender to control the road. And it was in fact controlled by one of the president's son-in-laws through an offshore holding company based in the British Virgin Islands. So whilst the government and taxpayers had to pay back this $280 million loan to China, the presidential family was profiting to the tune of an estimated $200 million a year in the tolls that it was charging for this road. So what are the implications of this sort of for Tajikistan? And what are the implications for sort of security, international security? So first, sort of, obviously, the state within Tajikistan, access to the state, being part of the state, is an opportunity to make money. And so this creates strong incentives to maintain the status quo. So as many other sort of authors have argued, kleptocracy, kleptocratic systems of rule, strengthen authoritarianism. Being part of the state provides material benefits. The state, as an analyst of Kyrgyzstan, Johan Engvall, has said, is an investment market. But it's not a free investment market. It's not a free market. The distribution of goods and benefits from the state is unequally distributed. So this sort of system creates incentives to defend this status quo for individuals within the state to expand their influence and to purge their rivals. And this has, in the case of Tajikistan, very serious consequences for security. So the process of sort of state formation since the end of the Civil War has involved a series of pacts amongst the elite. So Tajikistan was the only country in the region to experience a civil war between 1992 and 1997, and that ended with a peace deal. And in the peace deal involved incorporating some of the opposition into the government. But gradually, as the kleptocratic state and the family have tried to take control of the country and continue to dominate the state, they gradually purged out those people from their positions of power those rival individuals who were originally associated with the opposition. And so this has created conflict in the Rasht Valley in the east of the country between 2008 and 2011, in Horog in the Pamirs up until this day, and then most recently in Dushanbe and Vaghdad in 2015. All of these incidents, all of which were violent confrontations between the state and these former state officials, really should be understood through the politics of kleptocracy. These individuals were forced out of their lucrative positions in the state by rivals within that state, and because of the material benefits that being part of this state entailed, they reacted violently, and this produced violence. So kleptocracy is inherently, in a context of weak state capacity, kleptocracy has a tendency to be inherently unstable. These struggles, as the case of the Talco litigation in London indicate, are increasingly taking place extraterritorial in these offshore areas. In foreign courtrooms, as we've talked about, in parliaments, through lobbying processes, and through something that I've looked at in my research, transnational repression. Transnational repression refers to the sort of repressive acts taken by states to target their exiles, citizens living abroad, including things like assassinations and the abuse of Interpol. So just in my sort of final remarks, I'm going to talk a little bit about the links between kleptocracy and transnational repression, particularly through the case of Interpol. Tajikistan has something, according to its own statistics, 2,500 red notices in circulation. For those of you who don't know, red notices are effectively arrest requests. They're not arrest warrants, but they're arrest requests for individuals that are distributed through Interpol's network of, I think, 193 or 194 member states around the world. So that's 2.3% of the total number in circulation at this present moment, despite the fact that the country only represents 0.1% of the world's population. So as a per capita abuser of the Interpol system, Tajikistan is certainly quite prominent. It's not alone in abusing Interpol, and part of this has been to do with partly the rise of kleptocracy explains the rapid proliferation in the number of red notices in recent years. So in 2005, according to its own statistics, Interpol had 1,277 red notices in circulation. By 2017, this number had skyrocketed to 52,103. This is a 40-fold increase. Partly this is explained through introduction of something called iLink, which was sort of sped up the process of by which people could upload these red notices to the system, distribute them. Partly it's to do with foreign fighters and sort of what's been happening in Syria and Iraq, Interpol being used to pursue foreign fighters. But it is also linked to this growing global authoritarianism that sort of reached headlines recently with the detention of the head of Interpol himself in China. One illustrative case of how this sort of abuse of Interpol, transnational repression, is linked to kleptocracy in Tajikistan is the case of Umar Ali Kuvatov, who was between 2001 and 2011, ran two companies partnered with Shamsullah Sohibov, one of the son-in-laws of the president. And they were involved supplying oil within the country and also oil to NATO forces in Afghanistan, just to the south. But in 2012, the president's son-in-law forcefully took control of the business from Kuvatov, and he had to flee the country. He subsequently released compromat, compromising information, documenting kleptocracy within the country and corruption within the country. And quickly, the prosecutor general of the country filed criminal charges against him, accused him of fraud, embezzlement, and sent an international arrest request, or red notice, through Interpol. Kuvatov sort of flees from Russia, goes to Dubai, is detained for 8 months on that red notice upon arrival at Dubai International Airport, is eventually released at the end of 2012, moves to Turkey, and his sort of story ends tragically in March 2015 when he was assassinated by a masked gunman on the streets of Istanbul in Turkey, where he was living. So kleptocracy sort of is inherently interlinked with this sort of process of global authoritarianism, process of transnational repression by which kleptocrats and exiles and victims of government repression are pursued beyond the country's borders. As I said, sort of just to conclude, Tajikistan is not an isolated case. I could be talking about Venezuela, Equatorial Guinea, Angola, or Malaysia. The implications, sort of the security implications for domestic and international security that I've talked about are certainly seen elsewhere. If we look at South Sudan, when its civil war broke out in 2013, part of that certainly was the sort of kleptocratic nature of the state and the struggle over lootable resources from the oil industry that led to the sort of split within the Sudan's People's Liberation Movement. We can also look to examples from conflicts in the Central African Republic and the Democratic Republic of Congo, all of which are driven in part and perpetuated by sort of kleptocratic forms of governance. In neighboring Kazakhstan, closer to Central Asia where I work, there's been an ongoing transnational sort of case pursuing Mukhtar Blyazov, who was the former head of the BTA Bank, who was accused of embezzling $5 billion. Most dramatically, in 2013, his wife and daughter were kidnapped by Kazakh security forces in collaboration with the Italian police and flown back to Kazakhstan. Subsequently, they were allowed to return and sought asylum in Europe. As we know, Russia, which I haven't mentioned yet, is a major sort of point where there's this nexus between kleptocracy and transnational repression is present. We've seen, I can name many cases, but obviously the pursuit of numerous individuals related to Yukos and the Yukos affair who've been pursued throughout Europe. We can also point to the example of a senior Cypriot prosecutor, Eleni Loizidou, probably to butcher her name, who was revealed to have cooperated with the Russian government on various extradition cases. Cyprus, as many of you would know, is a major offshore tax haven where I think it's the largest investor in Russia, right? Even though it's mostly money that's being laundered and rediverted into the economy. So we are seeing the subversion, and I think this is what Casey will talk, so I won't talk about too much, of the global legal architecture in the interest of kleptocracy authoritarianism. China has routinely used Interpol to repatriate citizens as part of its ongoing anti-corruption campaign that had launched by Xi Jinping 6 years ago. According to its own statistics, it issued in 2016 alone 612 red notices through Interpol for economic fugitives, as it calls them, and has claimed to have repatriated over 2,000 exiles, of whom it accused of corruption. Another important power, the United Arab Emirates, which interestingly is the largest unilateral donor to Interpol, giving the organization $54 million last year, that equaled all of the statutory contributions by every other of the 193 members combined, has also been accused of using Interpol as a debt collector as a way of sometimes seizing assets from foreign individuals, investors within the country, and pursuing those individuals abroad. So kleptocracy, sort of, as I've mentioned, is sort of interlinked with this process of global authoritarianism, this process by which authoritarian regimes are increasingly the struggles taking place within authoritarian regimes, many of which are linked to kleptocracy, are taking place beyond its borders.
Very good.
Casey.
Oh, here's my PowerPoint presentation. Is it all right if I speak over there?
Sure, if you want to.
All
That's
right.
absolutely fine.
I'll move. Maybe this clicker works. Well, maybe it won't. Any idea how to get to the next slide?
We're gonna have our crack security IT team work on it.
Well, I can certainly hold. Well, in the interim, Ed, thanks for that fantastic talk. That overview of how Tajikistan is a wonderful case study in and of itself for kleptocratic, nepocratic as well. What was the term?
Nepotocracy.
Nepotocracy. Thank you. Obviously, the key to modern kleptocracy and modern kleptocratic networks, however, is not just making the money and not just capturing the industry in the states themselves, but offshoring that, moving it elsewhere, and housing it in safer, legally safer, and more structurally sound jurisdictions elsewhere. Unfortunately, I'm going to be bringing things a little bit closer to home with this talk. This is going to be 10, 15 minutes or so about how the U.S. over the past few decades has transformed, as some of you may be aware, into what many have argued is the world's largest offshore haven. What? Oh, change it. It's fine. I can talk and talk. The slides will
The slides will catch up.
The slides will catch up. That's all right. The first one's an intro anyways. So again, what I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to be looking at a handful of case studies, namely four individual states that have transformed the U.S. into the global hub of financial secrecy through a couple of mechanisms. One is anonymous shell companies in states like Delaware. The other one I'm going to talk about a little bit, which hasn't gotten nearly as much attention as anonymous shell companies, and that's anonymous trusts. So we're going to get to that, and that's in South Dakota. Once I move beyond that, we're going to, I'll just touch momentarily on who exactly is taking advantage of these, why these states have allowed the U.S. to sink to the level that it's now at, and what we can do about it, because there may be a silver lining. Well, you can just go to the next one. Perfect. As some of you may be familiar with, this is the logo for Mossack Fonseca, the Panamanian law firm that was at the heart of the Panama Papers. You'll see why I included it here momentarily. I'm ready for the next one already. So the first state that I wanted to talk about today is Delaware. You know, when we think about anonymous shell companies, obviously, I'm sure for many of you, the first state we think of is Delaware. And I call it, well, I don't call it, it's referred to here as Happy Delaware. And that was from a New York Times article back in the 1980s, because that's how they described Delaware as a state developing its company formation industry. Delaware had cracked the code of anonymity, and it had started bringing in tens and hundreds of millions of dollars, as you can see down here. Last check, over $1 billion annually as it pertains to forming anonymous shell companies. One of the reasons for that is because Delaware was at the very fore of developing the type of privacy and security protocols and legislation that kleptocrats and crooks and criminals and maybe some of the rest of us are looking for when you set up a shell company or a company in and of itself. That was the 1890s. Obviously, since then, it has developed a wonderful load of case law to back it up that allows it to come to the fore for those who are looking to set up these anonymous shell companies. In the 1920s and the 1930s, well, let me back up a second. Some of you may be aware that in the U.S., company formation, if you want to develop an anonymous shell company, it's on a state-by-state level. It's not national. That has been the case ever since the founding of this country. In the 20s and the 30s, there was an opportunity for Washington to take hold from the states. Unfortunately, that fell through. And so here we are today, where the U.S. is considered a leader, if not the leader, in anonymous shell company development. Delaware had a very simple model that it's set up. It takes the money and it doesn't ask any questions. It doesn't matter who is setting it up. It doesn't matter where they're coming from. As long as they don't do any business in Delaware, at least at the time, they didn't ask any questions, and you could have an anonymous shell company. It now has more corporations than people in the state. It's not a very big state, but it now has more corporations than people. So in a very real sense, the state legislators, the senators from Delaware, their constituents are companies rather than the people who live there. And this is the model. Delaware is the model. If nothing else, don't take anything else away. Delaware was the model that we have now that all other offshore jurisdictions, when it comes to shell companies, followed. Ed mentioned British Virgin Islands a few moments ago. He also mentioned to me earlier that there are some Tajik officials that may or may not have, or definitely did, set up some Delaware shell companies. So there's the transition. But when it came to Panama setting up its secrecy regime, when it came to the British Virgin Islands setting up its secrecy regime, they all pointed to Delaware. And my favorite quote in this slide, maybe not in the whole presentation, but certainly in this one, 2 years ago, there was an official in Crimea, a deputy in Simferopol, who mentioned that now that they had been annexed by Russia, there was a domestic discussion in Russia about setting up their own kind of internal offshore network. And where better to do that than in Crimea? And this official said, well, the U.S. has Delaware, the U.K. has BVI, why don't we have it in Crimea? This official was sanctioned by the U.S., and he's pointing directly to the U.S. as a model worth imitating in Crimea, which I think speaks volumes. Delaware's not the only one, though. We also have Nevada, which actively markets itself as the Delaware of the West. In the 90s and the early 2000s, it was facing a budget crunch, looked for ways to raise revenue because there are limits in Nevada on revenue generation, and so it decided, why don't we loosen corporate oversight? Why don't we provide the type of anonymity that Delaware has and do it for a little bit cheaper? Oh, it works. Thank you. And so they, again, began to actively market themselves as the Delaware of the West. What they did, which I thought was very smart, is they tied all the revenue that they make from this, which That last check was about $140 million, although it's probably more now. They tied it to teacher salaries, because who wants to argue against teacher salaries? So it's been very difficult pushback in the state when they say, when people advocate for shell company oversight and transparency, they say, well, do you want our teachers to earn less money? Of course not. Maybe they can get it somewhere else, though. And anyone in Nevada can act as a company formation agent. There's a famous quote from one of the state legislators, well, famous in the world of following shell companies, where the gentleman said, well, I have a black lab, his dog. His name is Jack. I have an address here in Nevada. Are you saying my dog can act as a company agent? I don't know if he followed through on that, but there's no reason to think that that couldn't actually happen. I don't know if anyone can read the quote at the bottom there. This is a screenshot from one of the main company formation companies, agencies in Nevada. It says, control everything and own nothing, which is technically a John D. Rockefeller quote, but I think speaks volumes about the ethos in the state of Nevada. The next state is Wyoming, which has a lot of people, well, I don't know if anyone's aware, but this is where the LLC was first developed, back in 1977. It wasn't initially developed as a means of financial secrecy or luxury real estate purchases. It was wildcat oil guys who were just looking for a couple extra protections. It just developed into what it is. Now it's referred to as the Little Cayman Islands, island on the Great Plains. They don't do it have the revenue directed toward teacher salaries. They direct the revenue toward the general budget in the state of Wyoming. And again, this is shell company, anonymous shell company formation. One of Mossack Fonseca's, that Panamanian firm at the heart of the Panama Papers, one of their favorite jurisdictions to send clients to. Between Wyoming and Nevada, those were specifically mentioned in Mossack Fonseca promotional material saying, hey, if you want your secrecy, you don't want anyone to come find out where your money is or how you're housing it or how you're moving it, go to Nevada, go to Wyoming. I'm very happy because I can finally use the phrase all hat, no cattle in a presentation, which I've never done before. Wyoming has a wonderful track record of talking a big game, big talk, about how they're doing everything they can for transparency's sake. This is a quote from the Secretary of State's office in Wyoming, and they're the ones that oversee company formation. He says, Wyoming has been the most proactive in directly confronting concerns related to improper use of shell companies. And that's about the same as President Trump saying, I've been the most transparent when it comes to my tax documents. It's not quite true. Anyone know who Pavlo Lazarenko is? Does that name ring a bell? Okay, we have a few here. Former Ukrainian prime minister, named one of Transparency International's top 10 kleptocrats of all time, accused of embezzling hundreds of millions of dollars, spiriting it out of Ukraine. This is the house in Cheyenne, Wyoming, that housed his shell companies. I took that picture a couple years ago. There's a barbershop and a nice church right next door, completely anonymous and just sitting there. Unfortunately, no one was home, so I couldn't ask them what they thought of being the home of Mr. Lazarenko. Oh, I wanted to go back to the Delaware one. This chart right here, which I forgot to mention, this is from a study a couple years ago looking at how certain jurisdictions, in this case U.S. states, complied with transparency requirements that they had technically agreed to, that the U.S. has technically agreed to. The lower you are, the worse it is, and 3 of the 5 bottom states are Delaware, Wyoming, and Nevada, so that much more context. Those were anonymous shell companies. A lot of people, I'm sure many of you, all of you are very familiar with what they can be used for, how they can be abused, what the major jurisdictions providing those are, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of that is due to things like the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers over the past couple of years. One of the next frontiers, I think my presumption is, as we see more legislation dedicated to oversight as it pertains to shell companies, one of the next tools that we see being used in kleptocratic networks are trusts. I'm not going to go too much into that, but I wanted to talk about one state in particular, and that's South Dakota. Back in the 80s, South Dakota was experimenting with a couple different financial tools to bring revenue to the state. In 1980, they repealed limits on interest rates. 1983, what they decided to do was remove entirely chronological caps on trusts. So trusts generally last for about 100 years or so before they're dissolved. What South Dakota decided to do was say, well, why don't we just have trusts that last forever? No matter how many beneficiaries are accrued, we'll call them perpetual trusts or dynasty trusts. People can come park their money anonymously, not taxed. You never have to set foot in the state. You just have to have someone who has an address there, and they can just leave it there. And South Dakota doesn't have to comply with any kind of other tax authorities in other jurisdictions or investigative reporters or other constituents. And as you can see in the graph there, they've done very well for themselves. They now have $220 billion, at least, in assets. Almost all of that is from out of the state. So that's the other state that I wanted to mention. What are the commonalities of these states? Well, just as we've seen with British overseas territories like BVI or Cayman Islands or St. Kitts or Bahamas, the Bahamas, these are very small states. These are states that don't have a lot of other means, or at least they don't perceive that they have a lot of other means of revenue generation. And so they rely on these tools and tactics of financial secrecy. These are, in effect, captured states, what we call pliable legislators who are working hand in glove with industry officials to make sure that the type of oversight and transparency that should be there doesn't actually come to pass. It's all a race to the bottom, creating the greatest protections for financial secrecy that they can. And then it's just Washington has just rolled over in front of one of the organizations lobbying to keep these these types of anonymous shell companies going is the National Association for Secretaries of State. Washington has seemed impotent in their face, unfortunately. You can see over here, there's a chart from the Tax Justice Network, the most recent financial secrecy index. The U.S. is not number one, thankfully. That's Switzerland. We're number 2. So maybe we'll get them next year. Who's taking advantage? The worst of the worst. We have El Chapo up top. We have Victor Boots, the greatest gun runner, gun smuggler of the last quarter century. And we have the president's former lawyer down below, Mr. Cohen, who's been in the news the past couple days for a couple other things, all of whom opened anonymous shell companies as part of their networks. We have 2 quotes right here. One is from a lawyer specializing in company formation who said that since we don't know who's opening these shell companies in Delaware, Wyoming, and Nevada, it's entirely possible that groups like ISIS or the Taliban or whomever, whichever network, are operating some of these networks. And since we're speaking at the Kennan Institute today, the second quote is from the DOJ's National Money Laundering Risk Assessment, pointing specifically to Eurasian organized crime groups, I think as we learned a lot about over the last year or two, also using shell company networks. All that said, there might be a silver lining. Finally, we have seen the rhetoric on this begin to change. We had Treasury Secretary Mnuchin come out 6 months ago and say it's time for oversight, it's time for transparency when it comes to shell companies. We saw the Delaware Secretary of State, of all people. I mean, this is the gentleman who oversees company formation in Delaware, say the same thing. And then there are civil society groups. And so I want to give a big tip of my hat to groups like the FACT Coalition, who have worked so hard to get us to where we are now that we might actually, in 2019, finally see some kind of oversight as it pertains to shell companies. And as the last slide, does anyone know who this is? Oh, Charles knows. I'm just going to go to the next slide anyway. This is Ike Cavalladze. He was one of the very fortunate few to have attended the now infamous June 2016 Trump Tower meeting, alongside a handful of others. No one's quite sure why he was there. They said he was a translator, but there was another translator. Why do they need 2? It just so happens that he has a very distinct history of opening up Delaware shell companies. He's opened up at least 2,000 that we know of, that moved at least $1.4 billion out of Russia and Eastern Europe that we know of. And he was referred to by Senator Levin as the poster boy for post-Soviet groups opening up American shell companies to move their money. So hopefully we learn a little bit more about his role very soon.
Thanks very much, Casey. Jodi, floor is yours.
All right, thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. So I'm going to pick up, we've got the great case study of Tajikistan. We've got one of the key institutions that facilitates kleptocracy. That's the ability to move money. And I'm going to be talking about one of the other main institutions that enable kleptocracy, and that's the role of the security sector. If you're going to run a kleptocracy, leaders will use all sorts of means to try to legitimate themselves. They may use culture, history, religion, gender, whatever it is to justify, why they get more kind of than everybody else. But in the end of the day, if you're going to take that much stuff, you're going to have to use violence or the threat of violence. And that's where, depending on the makeup of the kleptocracy, the security sector is going to come in. So I'm going to talk about the role of the security sector from 3 particular areas. The first one is just specifically the role that the regime relies on of that security sector. The regime itself, if you often notice when we're talking about security sectors, Tajikistan, anywhere else, is how often that the key security sector is run by someone who is very much within the trusted circle, often a brother-in-law, a brother, uncle. It may be run by the kleptocrat itself, or depending on the type of liberation movement, someone who served with them for many decades in the liberation movement. That's because they are one of the key institutions for maintaining the kleptocracy itself. In the end, you're going to need people with guns to maintain your position in that kleptocracy, and you're going to have to keep them very happy, because they can be defending you as the kleptocrat and the family and regime, or they can turn those guns on you and take it themselves, because that's a very lucrative position to be in. So you'll usually find the security sectors in these countries are incredibly well incentivized to maintain loyalty, at least the elites in these security sectors. This becomes a real problem when the United States gives a great deal of aid to these countries without looking specifically in what they do, particularly security sector assistance. As we see in these regimes, the security sectors themselves are not there necessarily to guard borders of the country, although that might be officially their mission statement, or for the protection of the citizens of the country itself. They are there for regime survival and maintaining that regime itself. And so they are often highly predatory forces in these countries. That means that whether it's Russia that provides training, China that provides training, the United States, private security companies, or whatever, what that does is tends to take a predatory force and makes it more effective at being predatory. It also tends to incentivize both the regime and the security sector itself away from the types of things that we would like to see and that make valuable allies in these sorts of countries. It tends to disincentivize them towards democracy, towards rule of law, towards free markets, and all of those things that the United States believes in and finds helpful and useful as far as operating in the world today. So that's the first key area where this becomes a problem. The second is the role that it plays in building grievances in the population and incentivizing corruption, larger scale corruption, conflict, terrorism, insurgency, large scale criminality, you name it. In an ideal world, the population would have the opportunity of choosing who they wanted to govern them and so forth, and they would pick whoever was the best in governing, but often populations don't have that. They have to take the least bad of all the possible choices out there. And oftentimes, criminal organizations, insurgent organizations, terrorist organizations are a better option than it is to actually deal with a very illegitimate, highly predatory government. A great example of that right now would be Afghanistan. When we're dealing with warlords and so forth that are actually within the Afghan government itself, all the Afghan government really had to do was outgovern the Taliban. And if you're familiar with the Taliban prior to 2001, you know that's a remarkably low bar. And yet somehow many within the government have failed to achieve that remarkably low bar. And so it's not uncommon oftentimes that the Taliban itself, depending on individual commanders and individual geographic areas, will be less predatory on the population than the actual government that's supposed to be defending them. And so we see that where people very rationally will choose to join insurgencies or terrorist groups or otherwise because whether the best paying jobs in town, they believe in the rhetoric that they're going to protect them, because they're coerced into it, and there is no state to protect them or provide an alternative, because the insurgents use their share of violence as well to coerce a population in, and we can't forget that overall. But it provides the kind of grievances and opportunities that enable the kind of conflicts that end up getting U.S. troops deployed and killed. The third area that we often fail to note is what actual kleptocracy does to the security sector itself. It tends to hollow out the security sector and mean that security sector, even if it wanted to, is incapable of responding to insurgencies, large-scale criminality, terrorism, and so forth, even if it had the will to do so. Often in many countries, the security sector budget, whether official or unofficial, whether it's published or not, because not all countries publish their budgets, will be the largest part of the budget, and in a few countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, to be over 50% of the budget. Often, there is no oversight of that budget. Often, there's even laws that forbid oversight of that budget. Even basic things like how many boots did the military procure this year or something like that. Very, very basic stuff. Neither civil society nor parliament can ask those questions or receive responses to it. The result is you have a large pool of money, no transparency, oversight, or accountability, and what could go wrong? So as you can imagine, this is a common area to use for patronage, for outright corruption, for money laundering, and so forth. A great example of this would be in Nigeria, where there are credible allegations that under the previous regime of Goodluck Jonathan, one of the senior military advisors to the President Goodluck Jonathan recognizing you might have heard they're fighting an insurgency, Boko Haram. There were $2 billion in contracts given out for ammunition, helicopters, and so forth to fight Boko Haram. It appears that those were phantom companies, phantom contracts, meaning that the companies themselves weren't actually companies. The $2 billion went in for the ammunition and so forth, but there were no actual contracts, no ammunition or everything else. It just disappeared. It looks like some of it probably went into Goodluck Jonathan's unsuccessful presidential bid for re-election. The rest of it, we don't know where it went, presumably around the world through the various illicit financial flows that Casey has talked about just recently. For all we know, it's here. Who knows? But we do know is that it didn't go to fight Boko Haram. And $2 billion is a lot of money. I think at the time the budget itself was about $5 billion for the Nigerian security sector. So very substantial. These have real impacts on doing things like fighting terrorism, fighting insurgencies and criminality and so forth. The other issue that we deal with in these particular countries is that when actual supplies do get to troops, they're usually overpriced, they're poor quality, they're not at all what troops need, often because the contracting itself is done as a form of patronage or to make sure somebody's brother-in-law got a contract or something. It's not about actually providing what is needed to fight crime, insurgency, terrorism, and so forth. It's about what was needed and who needed to be contracted or who offered the biggest bribes, and not what the actual security sector means. In these particular environments as well, the security sector is often the elites are based on who you know or who you pay off to get your commission. If anybody likes to read old British novels and you read about like British officers paying for certain commissions, okay, that went away for a good reason. Incompetent people paying to get commissions, while it might look really cool in Jane Austen and the uniforms are cute in the movies on BBC, do not work very, very well overall. And there's a good reason that went away. And when we're talking about paying off these sorts of commissions, for example, I'll pick on Afghanistan again. We were never able to confirm how much money was being spent for senior positions, but we had multiple credible sources that said that a typical high-level job in the Customs and Border Patrol in Afghanistan cost about $2 million. The pay was a little over $1,000 a month, so it probably wasn't for the pay. What we have in these situations is we have then very, very poor quality leadership and highly politicized leadership in the country based on who you know, or individuals who've invested in becoming officers and senior elites because it's a business proposition. And if you've invested good money as a business proposition, it's very bad business to actually fight. To expend ammunition to get killed is really bad for your business prospects in the future. So we tend to see fighting forces that are very, very, tend to leave rather than fight. Because the officers are politicized and out for business, we tend to see situations where troops either turn on their officers or defect entirely because they don't trust them. Officers who leave their troops to die. As you can imagine, it's not a very effective fighting force. We often see a number of ghost soldiers and entire ghost units. It's not uncommon in countries where we've done studies to find ghost soldiers or as much as a third of the overall units. That means names exist on paper, but there's no actual soldier behind it. So if you're a commander, picture yourself with a unit that's only 2/3 strength, not because people are on leave or training or anything else, but because a third of the troops just don't exist. They're there only so you can collect their money and their rations and their weapons to sell on the black market and as part of your patronage network, but they're not actually functioning as a military unit. Or entire ghost units in some cases. A great example would be the fall of Mosul in Iraq in 2014. We put, I think, $60 billion into the Iraqi security forces, tons of equipment, modern equipment, trained everybody up and everything else. Mosul, the second biggest city in Iraq, fell in a number of days to a bunch of guys in pickup trucks with machine guns on the back, what we call technicals. Some of the reasons that occurred, one is because many of the units that on paper were defending Mosul were actually ghost units. There was a headquarters unit that in theory was leading a real unit, but there were no actual soldiers attached to it beyond that headquarters unit. It's very hard for a paper military unit to fight a real ISIS force. It's just not going to go well for you. The other is that we have cases where officers paid off ISIS and took off and left their troops behind. Those troops then made up some of those mass graves of 1,000+ soldiers that you've seen. Not only, of course, are those soldiers killed, but as that moves down the line that some officers have defected, you can imagine that other NCOs and so forth have rationally chosen to take off and run rather than defend Mosul, because why would they stay if they fear that their officers are going to do the same? So this is why we often see militaries with large budgets and large amounts of money and equipment coming in, but that when there's actual fighting going on, they just absolutely collapse in a heartbeat. This is becoming particularly important for states as we're seeing that corruption is being used by states as a form of foreign policy tool, particularly in the case of Russia and China, but other states as well. We've usually seen corruption as something where individuals in a government and companies or whatever are paying off bribes or whatever for some sort of personal economic advantage from themselves, the abuse of public authority for private gain. But what we see now is not unlike with the hybrid warfare in Ukraine. In hybrid warfare, you have this kind of situation in Ukraine, what we call the little green man phenomena, where we had a combination of state forces from Russia, non-state forces, including criminal groups, and state forces pretending to be non-state forces, guys taking off their patches, that were in the Russian military yesterday and are not today, operating in Ukraine in a very fuzzy sort of environment. We see similar things going on with states, particularly Russia or China, using corruption itself as a foreign policy tool. Again, in the economic environment where corporations may be sort of state-owned enterprises, but not state-owned enterprises, or they're officially private, but not quite private, companies like Gazprom in the case of Russia, where they can then use that to undermine other states' governance itself or gain great economic advantage. So as part of that, particularly when we look at the Ukraine case study, is the ability to undermine the security sector itself to be able to respond to the threats of that government, the criminality and so forth, and hollow out many of the law enforcement and other institutions in the country. So it's becoming an increasing problem for the world, and as we watch the Mueller investigation, what I think we'll be seeing much more of in the United States itself. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jodi. 3 very interesting papers. I'm going to start with just a few questions. For Ed, I think you highlighted this notion of anti-corruption as being a tool, in fact, to promote corruption. So to what extent have all these kind of anti-corruption programs, and I've noticed the same phenomenon obviously in Russia and Ukraine, where they seize upon this issue of anti-corruption, and yet they have really no intention of fighting corruption. So to what extent has the anti-corruption program been co-opted by the corrupt kleptocratic figures that all of you are describing?
Sure. No, well, I think you're right, and I think countries like Tajikistan are learning from Russia, and they're learning from its anti-corruption agency and the way in which it's consolidated Putin's kleptocracy, particularly since 2003 and the Yukos affair, and maybe beginning even before that. And I think, as you say, anti-corruption is often a mask in these authoritarian states for the government and people within the sort of patrimonial networks of the state, be they state or non-state actors, to seize control of assets. Right? You accuse someone of fraud and corruption, you can then pursue them through Interpol because it's not seemingly politically motivated on the face of it. You can sort of frame them as being corrupt individuals, fraud, embezzlement, etc., and then you can sort of seize their assets, take over their businesses, and this is certainly something we've seen throughout Central Asia, Russia, and many other parts of the world. So I think in some cases, maybe individual cases, the anti-corruption efforts are sincere, but on the whole, within Central Asia, they're part of the broader sort of politics of authoritarianism.
Right, and for Casey and Jodi then, to what extent then is simply these countries learning at the feet of the master, as it were? Kind of, we're the ones who invented these entities, we're the ones who created the shell companies and the trusts and so forth. Have they just kind of taken this lesson and moved it a step beyond? Or, so to what extent, when we talk about tackling this problem and addressing this problem, clearly the statement from the Secretary of State from Delaware is a positive statement, although I imagine he hasn't informed the citizens of Delaware what all would entail if indeed they no longer were collecting all the fees for state company registrations. To what extent then is simply this is the way international commerce works, and it's just not going to change?
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. Well,
Throw it at me first.
yeah. Well.
Lowe and you, Casey. One thing that I've learned working with illicit finance over the years is that whenever somebody comes up with a good idea, it will rapidly be copied, whoever comes up with it. And so I'm very hesitant to say who came up with all of it or how it functioned or whatever, because not to get the U.S. off the hook, but because whether it be terrorist groups who copy each other or criminal groups or whatever, you know, greed is one of the 7 deadly sins, and it wasn't invented yesterday, and it wasn't invented prior to 1776 in the formation of the United States, and it's not going away tomorrow. I mean, the mark of a healthy society is not, can you suddenly have no greedy people? It's the mark of a healthy society is, do you have a political system that can respond to those sorts of issues? And that will be the issue that I think the U.S. faces going forward. I mean, there's a reason why Federalist 51 deals with issues of how do you deal with factions, and that if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. That's one of the things I've always loved about the Founding Fathers, is if you look at political theories, how much of them are set up with this idea that if you just create a perfect environment, everybody will be great. I've always loved the Founding Fathers because they work from the opposite. They work from this idea that, you know, people kind of suck. And we're going to use one person's greed against another person's greed. And so I think that is the one advantage where if the United States can get its feet back under it, I think it will have the real advantage. There was a point where the U.S. was the leader in true anti-corruption activity. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of 1977, which in a large part is a response to the last big set of scandals we have, which is Watergate. The last time we went through impeachments and everything else that we're seeing here. I mean, there was some new political space that opened up post-Watergate, just as there may be some new political space opening up in the United States in the coming years to do things that weren't politically palatable last year or this year or whatever. And so we will see what happens with the reemerging of the political system. But if a healthy polity is not that greed and corruption go away, because the minute we close off one thing, whether it's anonymous shell companies and we move to anonymous trust, from anonymous trust, somebody's going to figure out something. There's a lot of money involved, and greed is not going away. It's can we learn to adapt and respond to those in a manner before, you know, it's not shutting the barn door after the horses have already left. How do we respond to that in a more effective way?
Yeah, and I would say, well, to pick up on your point, your question about as it pertains to imitation, as it pertains to a sort of mirroring or implementing lessons learned, I mean, absolutely. We can look at that in either a domestic or an international context, you know, as it pertains to shell companies. As I pointed out in the presentation, there's a reason that Delaware's model was copied not only in Nevada and Wyoming, but copied in Panama and BVI and potentially Crimea in the future. As we see with trusts, other states, Alaska, Montana, are already following South Dakota's model. New Zealand, the Cook Islands, St. Kitts, following the model. If it works, why not try it out? That's the logic, that's the ethos. There's too much money to do otherwise. But I think one of the main, I don't want to say the primary takeaway, but I think certainly one of the main takeaways, or just things to keep in the back of your mind, is that kleptocracy is not a regime. Kleptocracy is not an individual. Kleptocracy is not a mode of thought. It is a network. It is an internationalization that requires multiple participants to move ill-gotten funds such that they can retain those funds away from the prying eyes of tax authorities, of investigative journalists, of constituents and concerned citizens. And the U.S., unfortunately, plays one of the keys, if not the key role or key node, or at least key model within that. There was some of you may be familiar with the Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, which is an absolutely wonderful tool. Comes out annually. Highly recommend taking a look at it. One of the conversations those individuals and experts have that I've been fortunate to be privy to over the last couple of years is that a tool that can exist in and of itself that covers all of the topics we've discussed today, or is there a new type of index similar to the Tax Justice Network's Financial Secrecy Index as it pertains to kleptocracy? And if so, where does the U.S. rank on that? Is it number one, or is it number two after Switzerland, or after Liechtenstein, or after Luxembourg, or what have you? Are there greater analytical tools that we require moving forward in order to have a better analytical understanding of kleptocracy as a phenomenon, as an internationalized network in and of itself?
Open the floor to questions. Right here.
Thank you very much, David Brinowitz. It doesn't seem like you're painting a very pretty picture. And I have two questions. First, are there any honest governments in this world? And second, are there any examples of a kleptocratic government being replaced by something better? And how would that have been done?
I don't know about your first question. I would think perhaps not. Maybe there are honest individuals within government, but maybe they're in a minority across the world, and it depends on each country. The only example I can think of, and it's a flawed example, is from Central Asia, and that was the overthrow of the Bakiyev regime in 2010 in Kyrgyzstan. He had sort of come to power in 2005 in another revolution, and he took a lot of the money that was being given, again linked to Jodi's point, in fuel contracts, because every US troop going to Afghanistan transited through the Manas air base just outside the capital city, Bishkek. He took hundreds of millions of dollars in DoD money, diverted through various offshore companies, and effectively embezzled hundreds of millions of dollars through these fuel contracts. And that played a huge role in his particularly in the negative press that led to his overthrow. And the government that came to power in 2010 is certainly not democratic in the sort of liberal democratic sense, but it's certainly more open. And I think sort of the kleptocratic system overall certainly played a role in his overthrow, and the replacement was slightly better.
Just to build off of Ed's point, and to again highlight the internationalization and the West's culpability within this, while Mr. Bakiyev is in Belarus, I believe, at last check, he's still living it up in Minsk. After his overthrow, his son, Maxim Bakiyev, who was if memory serves, in charge of security services in Kyrgyzstan, has a wonderful luxury pad still just outside. Is it outside? I don't know my English. In Surrey. That, as far as I understand, he still owns, despite, the U.S. had an extradition attempt a couple years ago that fell through. But that, again, highlights the wonderful nodes and networks that exist between regimes and, in this case, Western property markets, although, again, that's by no means limited to just that.
As someone who transited through Manas Air Base, coming and going to Afghanistan, and drank the Kyrgyz beer that was there in the beer tent, because you couldn't drink in Afghanistan officially, I will take a little bit, however, of a longer view of things, and that is, to answer your question different ways, but I'll start with your second question first. I think if we look in the big picture, and we think back to, say, 200 years ago, think of how many proper consolidated democracies we would have had. Basically zero, maybe kind of the UK moving in the right direction, US with a constitution, but not, and more enfranchisement than most. So I think when you look at the really long picture, as highly problematic as we have with kleptocracy today, go wander around Europe and take a look at the Palace of Versailles. You know, that wasn't provided with donations. Go look at the Vatican, again, not provided with donations, that was money that didn't go back to the poor or whatever. Kleptocracy, the willingness of individuals to try to get as much as they can and get away with it, whether you judge it as divine right of kings, I am the state, or whatever, this is not something that just showed up yesterday. I think one of the, strangely enough, encouraging signs is that part of the reason we talk about kleptocracy, and we don't treat, say, the Palace of Versailles the same way as we treat Erdogan's giant palace that he built in not Istanbul, Istanbul. Yeah, the 1,100 room monstrosity he built in a national park, is because what states are expected to owe their people has changed dramatically. So, 200 years ago, states weren't responsible for infrastructure, public schools, health, providing a regulatory environment that allowed for economic growth, any of those sort of situations. So in a good way, the goalposts keep moving. I mean, even Putin is smart enough to pretend that he's president and prime minister because he knows it's bad just to say king. It's awkward, even though we call him Tsar Putin, it's awkward nowadays. So I think in many ways, we do see, whether it's the number of people living in absolute poverty, the percentage of people worldwide living in absolute poverty that have dropped, the people living in some form of democratic system that would not have existed even 100 years ago. Like, the long term, there's good news. The short term, however, is highly troubling right now, and what it will be happening with that, whether this becomes a great moment where we do go through a big jump moving forward, where we do have new changes in laws. There's a lot of changes in laws going on in anti-money laundering and so forth in Europe right now. There's the possibilities in a couple of years that the U.S. could be doing the same thing, so it could be a big jump in, again, changing those goalposts and what governments owe their people and responding, or maybe not, we don't know yet. But taking the much longer view, I think you have to look at the fact that what states were expected to do now versus even 50 years ago is massively different. And the fact that we expect states to provide more and are upset when they don't is actually a good sign. That getting back to, are there good states or bad? I think in some ways this is to borrow from Dickens, kind of both the best of times and the worst of times. And this will always be, I mean, again, greed is not going away. Every time, it's not like we put out an anti-corruption law and everything goes away. I get kind of frustrated when, you know, if you put out, let's say a city puts out a law that says it's illegal to burglarize people's places, and then burglary doesn't go away, like, people would, you know, well, of course it's not going to go away. You're always going to need the police. Burglars are always going to try to find new ways. You get a burglar alarm, they're going to find a way to get around the burglar alarm and so forth. And corruption is not going to be any different. Just because you make a couple anti-corruption laws and maybe put a court in doesn't mean that people suddenly become all nice and good and corruption goes away. This is going to be a constant problem forever. And that will be true in any sort of government. And I think the fact that you have these massive uprisings of people who are fighting against corruption, at the same time, often their states are clamping down and trying to maintain their kleptocratic regime. That constant fight is never going to go away in humanity. Someone's always going to try to game the system. But the fact that it's going on, to me, is in many ways good news.
Great. Here. Gentleman with glasses.
Excuse me.
I'd like to mention a case that I think is valuable for Americans to remember and be aware of if they aren't already. With the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990, a bunch of American economists went off to Russia to teach the Russians the workings of capitalism. Many of these economists were associated with Harvard University, so they became known as the Harvard Group. And in the 10 years that they were consulting in Russia, Harvard's endowment went from about $3 billion to $30 billion. These economists are generally recognized now as having facilitated the pilfering of the Russian economy, which caused the Russian saying in Russia to become popular that under the Soviet Union, everything they were told was a lie. Everything they were told about communism was a lie. Everything they were told about capitalism was the truth. So I think it's important. I just had a discussion with my brother about corruption, and the first thing he does is mention Nigeria or some third world country. We tend to underestimate, I think, and divert our attention from our own responsibility for a lot of this. After all, a cynic would say, hey, we don't care about kleptocracy overseas as long as the capital's flown into this country. But I get the feeling there's so many panels like this on kleptocracy these days, books being written, Transparency International author came out with one about our role in all this. Do you get the feeling that there's an awareness amongst our leadership that kleptocracy has become counterproductive for the consequences that you so eloquently expressed, Ms. Vittori? That's my question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Well, I don't know about thank you for that wonderful question, because it's as pertinent as anything. I don't know that the awareness of counterproductivity has necessarily seeped into elected officials themselves, but I can certainly speak to kind of a pair of pieces of legislative momentum we've seen over the past year and a half, 2 years, one of which I mentioned in the slide, and that is the kind of final push toward some kind of legislation out of Washington pertaining to beneficial ownership or transparency for shell companies. And again, that's due to groups like the FACT Coalition and on-the-ground efforts from civil society organizations reminding legislators of the type of damage that these tools do to American interests abroad. I mean, yes, of course, the National Real Estate Association or the National Association of Secretaries of State are going to be lobbying against it, and they have their reasons to be doing so. It's their bottom line. It's in the interest of their own constituents to make sure this transparency never comes to pass. But there does seem as if there's been a corner turned in the world of transparency for shell companies. That's one. The other node that I didn't talk about was the American real estate market, especially the luxury real estate market in places like Manhattan, Miami, San Diego, what have you. In 2016, the Obama administration's Treasury Department passed something or enacted a pilot program called Geographic Targeting Orders, GTOs. And again, that is due to the exact fact that the types of kleptocratic regimes, nepotocracies, is that the right way? Okay. Nepotocracies parking their money in Manhattan high-rises and Malibu beachfronts and Miami condos had gotten to the point that it was just ridiculous. And so what the Treasury Department elected to do was say to title insurers, we need to know who's behind these purchases, who's behind these LLCs purchasing these $1 million mansions or $1 million high-rises. And it turns out that that program was incredibly effective, not only in terms of driving down prices and driving down these types of anonymous purchases, but such that it's now expanded this oversight program out of Treasury to over a dozen jurisdictions and has now dropped from the $1 million threshold or $1.5 million threshold. Any real estate purchase over $300,000 in these dozen major jurisdictions in the U.S., Seattle, San Francisco, Chicago, Dallas, New York, and Miami, we now know who's behind those, or at least we have a name or a network, what have you, who's behind those. So that's been a wonderful development as far as I can tell, and deserves to be expanded nationwide, and hopefully will be. And it's also a nice bipartisan issue as well. We have Republicans and Democrats on both sides, Rubio and Wyden both lobbying for this. So yes, I'm sorry, that was a long answer.
Right here.
What about technology for technology? I'm thinking of cryptocurrency.
Is good or bad? Mostly, it's very hard to study cryptocurrency because it's, I mean, by definition, it's hard to track. It was set up that, for those who don't know, you run it through anonymizers like the Onion router, which you know better as Tor. Which was actually originally set out in part and supported in part by State Department and others to allow civil society groups to be able to speak anonymously and to avoid the kind of censorship that occurs in these kleptocratic regimes and get around those. They've been taken over what looks like from the limited data, and it's always hard to measure something that is working very hard to be hidden. So I'm always very careful about statistics or anything. But it does look like a high proportion of what is going on in cryptocurrencies is criminally based. Cryptocurrencies themselves, from a currency perspective, are terrible. They're a bad holder of value. In particular, the price rises and falls very rapidly, unlike, say, the U.S. dollar or something. They could be hard to cash out. There's a lot of questions. There's no law enforcement when it comes to virtual currency, so you have these massive thefts in the currency exchanges of people who just collect currency and run off with it, cash it out into something more useful and leave. So it does look like there's other than just like the hardcore libertarian and for just people who think it's fun to own a Bitcoin, that they're increasingly being seen as either a combination of Ponzi scheme or an easy way to move money around. And I think you really saw that in two particular cases that were linked. One of them was Russia looking to set up its own cryptocurrency, and then Russia helping Venezuela set up the petro, which was supposed to be their own cryptocurrency. No exchanges would take the petro because they all recognized that it was just a scam. Nobody was touching the thing. And so I think that says a lot to itself. There are certain things that cryptocurrencies and the blockchain with it can do, however. The blockchain can be very, very good for nearly unbreakable contracts and so forth. One of the issues we deal with in kleptocracies, for example, is faked records, faked land records. Suddenly the brother-in-law of the dictator owns a bunch of land that he didn't before, and the small claimants can't get through courts or whatever. Some of the things that the blockchain can do is make those harder to fake, for example. Doesn't mean the kleptocrat will care, but at least it's public that they've gotten caught trying to switch out contracts and stuff, and there have been some good anti-corruption moves in there. So the blockchain itself will probably move forward. It's really unclear in the economic level right now what's going to happen with virtual currencies in the long term.
Right here in the front.
Hi, I'm Paul Massaro. Is this on?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm Paul Massaro. I'm the International Anti-Corruption Advisor at the U.S. Helsinki Commission on the Hill. I'm becoming more and more interested in reputation laundering and exactly how that kind of thing is done, and the normative impacts of kleptocracy, essentially 30 years of kleptocracy, pretty much. So as we don't know who to trust, what's real, what's going on anymore, and how this has been kind of a result of people using international organizations that previously had great reputations, or prizes that previously had great reputations, et cetera, to turn themselves from kleptocratic dictator into, grand global philanthropist. So I don't know if anyone wants to take that. It's not really a question, just something that I'm becoming more and more interested in, something I'd love to hear your perspectives on. Thanks.
I think from the perspective of something like Interpol, right, it's not sort of it's used by authoritarian regimes, and I just worked on a piece of a Journal of Democracy on this, and I was looking at some of the Turkish, Russian, Central Asian media, right, and they all frame Interpol as an international organization. It has 194 members, using a red notice, has a certain legitimacy, right? And so I think, as you say, it's a good way for for kleptocrats, for authoritarian regimes to sort of pursue their opponents, their rivals, as being, terrorists or as being corrupt, et cetera, because there's the assumption, and this is repeated again and again through the media, that, just having a red notice accepted into the system is already sort of proof that they're guilty, or at least that the claims against them have some sort of veracity and believability. So I think global authoritarian regimes are sort of subverting organizations like Interpol, and it has a practical effect, but I think also importantly a sort of symbolic effect, as you say, sort of reputational effect on the reputation of the autocrats on the one hand, who are seen as sort of pursuing or working in collaboration with other law enforcement, and there's a global consensus here, and sort of in discrediting opponents.
I will say, Paul, to your statement or what have you, there are few things in this world as disappointing as opening up a new web page in the morning or going on Twitter, what have you, and seeing a link to the Washington Post analyzing how one of the directors or one of the individuals at some place like Brookings has been actually working close with Huawei for years and working on their behalf and lobbying on their behalf. And for an institution like Brookings to have that take place is as damning and condemnatory as anything. But I also want to mention that we have no idea how the Mueller investigation is going to end. No idea who's going to be indicted or targeted, what have you. But one of the very positive effects we've seen thus far is the spike in Foreign Agent Registration Act filings. It's obviously not comprehensive, but we have seen a massive jump in filings and resultant transparency that will hopefully continue for the foreseeable future as those reputation launderers, the PR and spin men, are forced out of whatever shadows they've been in and their clients alongside. So there's hope there. Sorry, that wasn't really an answer either.
Okay, so I now see a lot of hands rising up here. So let's go. It's going to take those two there, and then we're going to take Lyndon and down here for next. So we're going to take those two up first, and then we'll take all four, and then we'll see where we are. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm John Rush at Georgetown Law Center. One aspect of the kleptocracy problem that I haven't heard any of the panelists address yet is in those situations where presumably regime change can't occur, what can be done to repatriate stolen assets and put them back, in a very general sense, where they belong? I'm just curious to know, do any of you have any perspectives on it? Because I think there's been a lot of tension, frankly, between some of the countries that have been victims of kleptocracy and now other countries, whether it's the United States or other jurisdictions, have said, okay, we found $500 million, $1 billion. What are the terms and conditions under which that country that's obtained the assets would now return them to that country? In essence, the question is, have any of you seen indications that there's a model that works, that actually has a high degree of confidence associated with it, that if you find that $5 billion that Sani Abacha took decades ago or something else, that it actually can be brought back and put to productive use rather than just being recycled into the next round of kleptocratic regime?
Okay. Behind you.
Thank you so much for such interesting presentation. My name is Jasmine Cameron. I work for Justice International, a small nonprofit organization. We provide legal assistance to human rights defenders and lawyers in Central Asia and Eurasia. And I guess my question is that the trends are pretty negative. Is Russia leading the way? And it just breaks my heart every time I go to Central Asia. I see those defendants and lawyers are fighting against impossible. And Edward, you gave a example of Bakiyev leaving as a sort of a example of what could be. But then again, there's an ex-president, Atambayev, and the current president, and it's all going in circles again and again. So the first part of the question is that what do you see happening with these negative trends going all over the world? in Central Asia, specifically in the next 5-10 years. And I'm not even talking about Turkmenistan, right, or Uzbekistan. And then from a practical aspect, do you have any recommendations for sort of small international organizations that don't have teeth, like, I don't know, U.S. Justice Department prosecuting those big cases, but more of a nonprofit, I guess, sector? How can we support individual citizens and defenders? Is there a way to provide assistance in a more sort of effective way?
Okay. And we're going to take these two down here, so Lyndon.
Thanks, Lyndon Allen, Baker McKenzie. Thanks for a great presentation. I wanted to ask, it's heartening to hear about the UBO transparency and the real estate transparency initiatives. And you just did, in response to a recent, to Paul's question, I think, touch on FARA enforcement going up. But I did want to ask about this because, of course, some people are content to just park their money in a beachfront property in Malibu. Some people, some kleptocrats or participants in those networks would like to use that money to either purchase influence in Washington or to purchase meetings for their friend who might want to become president of a third country in the same region, right? So there are these networks that extend not just getting the money out of the developing world into the West and storing it, but that actually are used then to kind of double down and say, well, actually, I'd like to back this person in this country, but gee, wouldn't it be nice if Uncle Sam would also have photo ops with this person? You know, you mentioned DOD contracts in Bakiyev, not a great model of transparency, our DOD. So I guess what I'm asking about is transparency for the actual kleptocrats as UBOs is one thing, increased FARA filings is a good thing, but that regime is not really adapted to the 21st century. And I know there's been some efforts. There was a, I think what was intended to be sort of a tone-setting op-ed by Joe Biden and I can't remember the co-author about foreign dark money. To me, this is all part of the same issue set. So I wonder if you guys, it's kind of a vague question, maybe more of a comment, but if there's anything that you all could say about those efforts in the coming Congress, that would be appreciated.
Well, we're gonna get the
we
last
got one
question.
more?
We got one more question. here.
Sorry, one more.
Yes.
Nancy Lubin. And first of all, thanks to all of you. But my question is that on the one hand, it's great to see that this has become such a big issue over the last few years. But as a little old lady over here, this was a huge issue in the 90s. You know, with all the Harvard stuff coming out, there were books written about it like mad. There were a bunch of people hired by NGOs, myself included, who were briefing the FBI, who were doing evaluations of aid programs all over the place, aid with a little a, highlighting how we were just making corruption worse, you know, and there were all kinds of discussions, just like the one today. And then it sort of panned out for a little bit, and it's come back. And this was in the early 80s, by the way, as well, just that there was different terminology. So on the one hand, it is fabulous, it's come back, but it's more complex now, and it's tougher when the biggest kleptocrats of all are also the ones who are funding just about every think tank in town, you know, and universities and programs, and everyone wants to go work at Nazarbayev University because they pay so much. So I'm wondering, how could you go into a little more what your own specific aims are as we talk broadly about kleptocrats and broadly about resistance in this country to really doing too much about it, even within our own country in Delaware, Trump Towers, whatever. What are your immediate objectives? Are there things that you're focusing on to begin to change first? And what are the other longer term objectives you have in mind? Or is this more an educational thing just to get more people revved up?
So we're going to give each of you about 3 minutes to round out these conversations. I think the underlying question is what is to be done, which is an appropriate question at any Russian discussion. But someone needs to also address the question about getting the money back as well. So if you can kind of address those two questions we'll just go down and we'll start with Jodi.
All right. Quickly on getting the money back. So as you know, there's usually pennies on the dollar at best that's going to be received. And one of the issues we have when there is when you can even find the assets is who do you return it to? Especially if as is often the case, one kleptocratic regime is replaced by another one. So you don't, do you really want to hand over the money right now to Nigeria or not? The case study to watch, actually, I think will be Nigeria and looking at dispersing funds to civil society groups, particularly linked to healthcare in the Maiduguri region, the areas most affected by Boko Haram. So trying to move around the state itself in those situations for disbursement, because handing it over from one corrupt state to another corrupt regime is not effective. So we'll see how it goes. We've tried many different things with asset recovery, and we haven't found the perfect thing yet. I think a couple of issues. One is with what you said particularly, I think from the overall perspective of what do we do about corruption, I think one of the reasons we're here right now and we're talking about illicit financial flows and security services and so forth is to better understand how all of these are linked and to start getting government responses and international responses that are better linked. We used to put everything, at least in the U.S. perspective, in silos, and we still do. That there's a Bureau of Counter-Narcotics that deals with narcotics issues separate from guys who deal with corruption, separate from guys who deal with security forces and so forth, that we don't see them as all part of the larger system. So I think where the academic work has done a wonderful job of showing where they're part of a linked system, and thus we can start having broader multidisciplinary approaches to it is going to be very effective. I work, of course, on primarily the national security side. I would like to see I'd like to see, first off, the U.S. military acknowledge and update how it understands conflict. Its doctrine and training is based on theories of conflict that are probably 30 years old, and there was a lot of new work that's good and empirically based that we don't see reflected in things like doctrine and so forth. We aren't going to probably see it now as those areas in the military that work on those, like the Peacekeeping Institute that was up at Carlisle Barracks, has been closed down. And as things like defense exports have been pushed regardless of human rights records, and I think you see that in the Adnan Khashoggi situation, where large defense exports, even now there's a new Patriot buy for the Saudis, even after all of this that's going through. So right now there is not the political space, but this is part of the putting together reasonable policy reforms for those situations where we want them. Things like, how does the U.S. work better with governments? Which governments do they work with under what circumstances? You can't just only work with clean governments, unfortunately, but how do we work more effectively with those governments? How do we understand how those governments work and where our interventions affect things?
Just to the question about repatriation, following confiscation, I think there are two other case examples. Well, let me back up. I don't think there's a gold standard that I'm aware of as it pertains to this, but there are two case studies that come to mind, at least in the Central Asian context, one in Kazakhstan and one in Uzbekistan. And apologies if you look this up after and I've butchered the details. In Kazakhstan, there was certain funds that the American government confiscated from the Nazarbayev regime, and the question was, how do we repatriate it, given that Nazarbayev is obviously still in power, and this year celebrating 40 years. No, I'm sorry, 30 years. My math was off. I'm a journalist. In power, the question is, what do they do? And so they set up, it was a charitable fund for, I believe, orphans. There's an orphanage. And there was some criticism that they received because there were it was a high overhead cost. But it was a model that worked to an extent. It also got back to the question of, we're only capturing or encapsulating a very small portion of what we know exists. Is it worth the effort, especially if the regime is still in power? The other one, and Katie, you probably have more details on this than I do, pertains to the assets seized from Gulnara Karimova, the daughter of the former Uzbek president. Tens of millions of dollars. 200 million? 800 million. Oh, okay. Yeah. It's a lot of money. So it's, for my money, the most fascinating aspect of current American-Uzbek relations is how do you repatriate that money? In what form? I mean, Mirziyoyev is obviously more democratic than Karimov, but he's not a liberal Democrat. What do we do with that? How does it work? And this has been an ongoing conversation for 2-3 years at this point.
Sort of setting court dates
right.
and continuing to negotiate how they're doing it.
Yeah.
So they haven't decided yet.
Okay.
The U.S. doesn't want to just let the money go, but they haven't quite figured out.
Yeah. This is Katie Putz. Please read the Diplomat magazine, especially for its Central Asian coverage. To the question of foreign dark money, foreign funding, reputational, I mean, it's part of the same machine, right? It's part of the same system. It's reputation laundering. It's regime entrenchment. It is whether it's lobbying, whether it's whitewashing, whether it's parking your money abroad. There are, it's funny because obviously we're not in a lobbying session right now, but my inclination would be that unfortunately it seems like we can only kind of focus on one bright light, whether it's fairer registration, whether it's beneficial ownership oversight, whether it's whether it's GTOs. It's a bit like whack-a-mole. You take care of one, there's still 18 other things you have to do, but you're still taking care of that one. So it might be something for the, whether it's the next congressional session, whether it's the next administration, after beneficial ownership is taken care of, after GTOs are nationwide, turning to, whatever means and mechanisms are still there and looking for specific legislation therein, because otherwise you're looking at that's a big picture. It's a big hill to climb. So,
Final word.
I guess I'll answer the question of sort of Central Asia and what small organizations can do. So I guess, as you probably know, I'm quite pessimistic about sort of transitions in Central Asia. I think we have kleptocratic regimes in Kazakhstan and Tajikistan, both of whom will be very interested in maintaining the status quo as they transition away from Nazarbayev, who is 80 years old, and Rahman, who's in his mid-60s. I think both of them will be looking to maintain the sistema, right? They'll be looking to maintain those sort of patrimonial systems. Uzbekistan is a sort of shining light to some degree, right? But what I see going on there is more of a process of authoritarian modernization, right? It's about opening up the economy, coming from that very low bar that Karimov set, and looking at some of the patterns of investment. We are seeing various oligarchs, Jodi, Alisher Osmanov, investing multiple billions of dollars into the country, but various reports have indicated that those investments are going through tax havens in Luxembourg and in Scotland. There's an address somewhere in Douglas, I think, somewhere in Midlothian, just near Glasgow, that is home to tens of thousands of offshore shell companies.
Those are the SLPs, the limited partnerships?
Yeah, exactly. It's an SLP, which is this weird legal sort of Scottish limited partnership thing. And Shodiev is sort of using that sort of offshore shell company to invest billions of dollars within the country. But obviously we're yet to see whether the sort of some of the benefits and certainly the tax revenues from those investments will come back. In terms of what small organizations can do, I guess just form coalitions, right? I think, Casey, we're all here part of sort of these coalitions, working groups between academics, activists, and organizations working in these fields. And I think that's the best way, if you're a small organization, to elevate your voice, is to work with other people, potentially to leverage different influence on the government.
Well, great. Thank you, Ed, Casey, and Jodi. And thanks to Daniel Morgan. And thank you all for coming. So we look forward to seeing you soon at future Kennan Institute events.